changes in the domain are represented to the rest of the world in the form of domain events. And so we're going to talk about domain events and how they are dealt with and treated and how they react and what reacts to them through this video. So if you haven't already seen the video, the Glee2 video about aggregates and entities, you should go back and watch that because it gives a bit of an introduction. I will touch just on the most important things here. So if you notice here on my screen, I've got the aggregate pulled up. So the aggregate is the abstract-based class that any of our entities would inherit from, and it has a few things on it. The most important things for this discussion are new change, which is the method that is used in every one of our public methods on our entities to actually grab the domain event and save it into this list of domain events. We also have the list of domain events, and then we have the get changes, which our repositories will use in just a minute. I'll show you that. So looking here at the employee entity, I'll just go over here and take a look at one of these methods. This is change tags. Change tags is the public method on the entity, sorry, on the employee. So you would do employee.change tags, pass in the ID, pass in the new tags, and then you would actually form this this domain event. By the way, this ID is not, it shouldn't be here, so it'll be gone pretty soon. We would use normally the ID that is on the actual entity itself. So I'll just do that right there. That'll break my build, but it's okay. So the idea is that we in the public method, we're always going to call when, which hits a private method. It also uses new change, which hits our method on the aggregate, the abstract base class. And then we instantiate a new event. And like I showed you in the other video, this event is just a plain old C# object. It is encapsulating and prevents mutation by taking in this the values in the constructor. It sets them in the constructor, and then there are no public setters. This event can only ever have these values once it's instantiated. It's really nice, prevents those mutation bugs that can happen later on. So then that new change actually adds the domain event to the list of domain events, which is useful in a few minutes. But then it also passes it here into the when, which enacts the change. It mutates the value there in the employee. We do this here because we don't have a public setter on the employee, which is good. We don't want mutations in the employee except for right here, where we have deemed it as authorized. We have authorized this change right here inside the employee. We don't want to change things from outside the employee. Okay, so this is the part that I want to focus on from now on for the rest of this video. I've got my domain event. The new change method is basically adding it to an array or a list of domain events. I'm going to put this back so that the build stops complaining. Okay, so now what happens to this domain event? Is it just going to sit there forever, or is something going to happen to it? Because apparently, or we have said that the domain events are the way that we represent the change to the rest of the world. So how does the rest of the world encounter this domain event? So to answer that question, we're going to go into our writable repository. Because if you remember, if you've watched the video about commands and handlers, you remember that each handler, in fact, I'll go ahead and just show you one. Our handlers basically go out. These are the command handlers. The command handler goes to the repository, gets the item, it makes the change on the item, and then it just saves it in the database. So you see there's nothing here that's special that is publishing these domain events out to anything. Nothing is, you don't see any evidence of domain events here. We shouldn't have to care about those domain events here in the command handler. But what we will care about is where we will care about it is in the update. So let's go into the update method on this repository. And here are a few things that you'd expect. You'd expect that the entity framework is going to update the entity. So that's what we're doing here. We are going to save the changes, which you would also expect that. And here is the thing that is actually publishing the events. So let's take a look here. This is a method on this repository called publish events. Let's just look at what's going on. Very simple method. It's taking in the entity, the aggregate also is it called. We are using, hey, there it is. We're using the get changes method on the entity to get the changes from all those domain events. So now we have an array or a collection of domain events, and we're going to iterate over those domain events, and we're going to dispatch each domain event. So the repository at this point, this is very similar to the dispatcher in the commands and handlers, but this is an event dispatcher instead of a command dispatcher. But the concept is the same. It's going to throw that event out into the ether, out into the wild, into the world, and the repository at this point, it doesn't care what happens after that. All its only responsibility is boom to send out that event out to transmit it out into the world and then move on with life. The repository doesn't have to care after that what happens with that. So there is some magic that goes on right here in the dispatcher. Because we want to be able to do something as a result of these domain events. It's not required. You can have 100 domain events and you can dispatch all 100 of them and then have absolutely nothing respond to those domain events. Um, on the other hand, you might have something that you do want to have happen. You may change the name or change the email address of an employee, and then you want to respond somehow with you want to send an email to their manager that their email address has changed or something like that. And so you could put the sending of that email in a domain event handler. So here what this does is this dispatch is going to take the type, which is why we're using classes for these domain events. It's going to take the type of the domain event, and it's going to go out into the app domain of our system and try to find a handler that matches. So let's go here to events in the domain events, in the events folder. And so here you can see, very similar to our commands and handlers, we have events and handlers. So let's take a look at the employee names changed. This is something, again, that the employee entity is using to cause the change on the actual, to cause the mutation on the actual employee. So we have the event here. It has the ID, which is not as useful on the employee itself, but it is useful for the rest of the world. So we want to include that. Here are all the changes that were made. And so if we want to respond to this event, we should have a matching event handler. And we don't, which means if this event is thrown, is published right here in our writable repository. If it publishes a employee names changed here, it will just fire and forget, and nothing will happen. But as you can see, we've got a few in here. We got address changed. So let's just imagine that the employee address changed. And it has the employee ID, it has the address, city, state, or city, region, country. And so if the writable repository actually if the writable repository publishes that event, then it will go out and try to find an event handler that matches it. So let's take a look at this one. We can see here that this is a very simple class, but we can see that the class is inheriting or implementing the event handler, not command handler, but event handler, and here is our event type, employee address changed. So by virtue of having that interface on this class, we see that we have a handle method that takes in that type of command. So this event handler is doing something really rudimentary, really simple, and really not very interesting. It's just writing to the console that the address was changed, and it just returns a completed task. Not very interesting, not very helpful. We could probably have all kinds of much more interesting um, examples in here, but for now, this is all we have. But you can imagine all the things that you could do, and you can imagine also the type of flexibility this gives to your domain. Anytime a change happens, it can be published then out into your application, and any of these handlers could intercept that change and do something with it. You could send emails, you could send text messages, you could update external databases, you could send a row of data to a spreadsheet, you could the possibilities are endless of things that you could do. This helps us to adhere to things like open close principle, where you don't necessarily, if code should remain open to extension but closed to modification. And so if you want to adhere to that and you're working in your employee entity, you don't want to have to open up your employee entity again to add more things, and even maybe things that don't really belong in as part of that entity, like an email sender. Uh, you don't have to go back and add lines to that employee entity. You can just add a new event handler because the event already exists. So the possibilities are completely wide open, and you can just let your imagination run free of all the amazing things you could do with this. And it's all because just a very simple thing of adding domain events to a collection in our entity, and then in our writable repository, just publishing them out. That's pretty much it. Have a great day.